Wade Mercer had ordered a wife the same way he ordered fence posts by mail by necessity, without apology. He stood at the edge of Harlan's Crossing, with his hat pulled low and his chest full of nothing but debt and stubbornness, watching the stagecoach roll in through a wall of Texas dust. He didn't do nervous. He didn't do hope. He did survival, nothing more. But when the door swung open and she stepped down, one trunk, quiet hands and eyes that looked straight into him like she was reading something he'd never shown another living soul, Wade Mercer felt the ground shift underneath 18 years of certainty. He'd sent for a worker. God had sent him something else entirely. If this story already has your heart, hit subscribe, follow along to the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this love travels. Wade had written the letter in February, sitting at the kitchen table with a whiskey he couldn't afford, and a ledger that made him sick to look at. He'd kept it short, practical. He wasn't a man who wasted words on paper any more than he wasted them in conversation, seeking a woman of working age, sturdy constitution, willing to assist with ranch duties. No prior experience required. Room and board provided. Harlan's Crossing, Texas. Contact W. Mercer. His neighbor Pete Alderman had laughed when he heard about it. You writing for a housekeeper or a wife, Wade? Same thing if you're smart about it. Pete had shaken his head. Lord help whatever woman answers that. Wade hadn't cared what Pete thought then. He didn't care now, standing in the dust outside the Harlan's Crossing stage depot, with his boots caked in dry mud and his second-best shirt ironed by his own hand because he didn't have anyone else to do it. That was the whole point. That was the reason for the letter, the agency fee he'd scraped together, the whole sorry business of ordering a human being like a piece of equipment. The Mercer Ranch was dying, not dramatically, not all at once. It was dying the way things die out in West Texas, slowly, quietly, under a sun that didn't care and a sky that offered no apologies. The cattle had been hit by fever 2 summers running. 3 of his best hands had left for better wages in New Mexico. The bank, specifically Frank Marsh at Harlan's First Savings, had restructured his loan twice, and each time the terms got worse, and each time Marsh smiled that particular smile of his, the one that said, I own more of you than you do. Wade was 41 years old. He'd built the ranch with his father, buried his father in the backfield, married a woman named Caroline, who had loved him fiercely, and died of fever 6 years ago. And he had kept going the way a man keeps going when there's nothing else to do but keep going. He worked from before dawn until after dark. He fixed what broke. He sold what he could. He ate plain food and slept hard and told himself it was enough, but the numbers didn't lie. He needed help. Real, daily, practical help. Someone to manage the house, keep the books straight. Maybe have a clear enough head in the morning to catch things he missed when exhaustion turned his brain to mud. He didn't need love. He'd had love. Love didn't keep the bank from your door. So he'd written the letter. Said. The stagecoach door opened, and a man got out first. A drummer with a sample case. Then an older woman with a hat that had seen better days, and then her. She wasn't what he'd pictured. He hadn't pictured much, honestly, but whatever vague shape he'd had in his head, she wasn't it. She was younger than he'd expected. Mid-20s, he guessed, with dark hair pinned neatly under a plain gray traveling hat. She was slight, but not fragile. There was something in the way she stood the moment her feet hit the ground. Both feet planted chin level, eyes moving. Not the eyes of someone arriving somewhere new, but the eyes of someone who was already assessing. She looked at the depot building, at the street, at the horses tied at the rail, at the sky, and then at him. She didn't flinch, didn't smile nervously, didn't do any of the things he might have expected from a woman who'd just traveled 3 days on a stagecoach to marry a stranger. She just looked at him. Mr. Mercer, she said. It wasn't a question. Miss Hartwell. A pause stretched between them. He waited for her to fill it. She didn't. You have more luggage, he asked finally. Just the trunk. He looked at the trunk the driver was pulling from the top of the coach. It was a single-piece, medium-sized, well-made, better made than anything he owned. He noticed that filed it away somewhere in the back of his head and picked it up. "Wagon's this way." She followed him without comment. They drove the 6 miles to the ranch in near silence. Wade had never been a man who talked to fill silence, and apparently she wasn't either, which he noted with something close to approval. He pointed out landmarks out of obligation, the creek that marked the eastern property line, the ridge where the cattle grazed in summer, and she nodded at each one, but he got the sense she was cataloging rather than simply listening. Her eyes moved constantly. The dry pastures, the state of the fence line, the condition of the horses pulling the wagon. "How many head do you run?" she asked about a mile from the ranch house. He glanced at her sideways. 140. Was 220 before the fever. "What strain of fever?" He looked at her again longer this time. "Texas fever. Tick-borne." "And your calving percentage this spring?" Wade set his jaw. 40%. She absorbed that without expression. "And the land itself, you own it outright." Something tightened in his chest. "I have a loan against part of it, through the local bank." "Miss Hartwell." He kept his voice even. "I appreciate the curiosity, but we've only just met." She turned and looked at him directly, and up close, those eyes were sharper than he'd prepared for gray-green steady, with none of the apology or social softness that usually lived in a woman's gaze when she spoke to a man she'd just met in his own territory. "You're right," she said simply. "I apologize. Old habit. Old habit." He turned that phrase over in his mind. Old habit for a 24-year-old woman who'd come off a stagecoach with one trunk from a church agency in Missouri. He didn't ask about it. He drove the rest of the way in silence and told himself it didn't matter. She stood in the kitchen of the ranch house for approximately 30 seconds before he realized she was not looking at it the way a woman looks at her new home. She was looking at it the way a man looks at a piece of machinery he's been asked to repair. She opened the cabinet beside the stove, looked at the flour and meal and dried beans inside, closed it, walked to the window above the dry sink, and looked out at the yard, the barn, the bunkhouse, the far fence line visible against the afternoon sky. "You've got one hand still working the place?" she asked. "Jimmy Creed, 16, good with horses. And you handle the cattle work yourself?" "Mostly." She turned back to the kitchen, and her gaze landed on the table in the corner, which had a stack of papers on it that Wade had meant to put away before she arrived and had not gotten around to. Too late now. She didn't move toward it, but he saw her clock it. "I'll need to understand the financial structure of the ranch," she said. "Not to pry, but if I'm going to be useful here, I need to know what I'm working with." Wade crossed his arms. "You were sent here to cook and keep house, Miss Hartwell." "I can do that," she said. "I can also help you keep this ranch from going under if you'll let me, but not if I'm working blind." The words landed with the quietness that was somehow more unsettling than if she'd shouted them. He stood there in his own kitchen, in his own house on land he'd worked his whole life, and felt the strange and unpleasant sensation of being the person in the room who knew less than he thought he did. "We'll talk about it," he said finally, "after supper." "Of course," she said, and turned to the stove, as if the conversation had concluded to her satisfaction. She cooked simply and well salt pork cornbread, a pot of beans that were better than his own, by a degree he found irritating to admit. Jimmy Creed ate with them at the table and watched Eliza Hartwell with the uncomplicated admiration of a 16-year-old who had no complicated thoughts about anything yet. "You been to Texas before, ma'am?" Jimmy asked. "No," she said. "Where you from originally?" A pause, brief, almost undetectable, but Wade caught it. "I grew up in different places," she said. "I spent some time in Missouri most recently." "You got family back there?" "No," she said again. "No family." Jimmy nodded and went back to his beans. Wade watched her face for something. Some flicker of grief or discomfort at the answer, and found nothing. Just that same settled quiet, like still water over a depth he couldn't see the bottom of. After supper, Jimmy went to the bunkhouse. Wade cleared the table. He was not a man accustomed to clearing tables, but there was something about doing it in front of her that felt important, a statement he couldn't quite articulate. She washed the dishes without being asked efficiently, without drama. When she was done, she dried her hands on a cloth and turned to him. "Can I see the ledger?" she asked. He should have said no. He knew it the moment he opened the cabinet under the window and pulled it out. A man didn't hand his financial records to a woman he'd known for 4 hours. But she'd asked with such directness, and he was so tired, and some part of him, the part that had been carrying this weight alone for years, just didn't have the energy to perform pride tonight. He set the ledger on the table. She sat down, opened it, and began to read. He stood across the table and watched her face. Most people, when they looked at his books, either politely looked away from the numbers or let their face fall into the expression, "People got around bad news," that gentle, helpless sympathy. She did neither. She read with the focused calm of someone who understood exactly what they were looking at and was already thinking 3 moves ahead. "You're current on the loan payments?" she asked without looking up. "Barely. The interest rate restructure in January Marsh raised it by 2 points, 1.5. Still," she turned a page, "and your cattle are grazing the north section now. East section, the grass is better. If you moved them to the north section and rested the east, you'd improve your pasture recovery by next spring." She looked up. "That alone could improve your calving numbers." Wade stared at her. "That's not what we're here to discuss." "No," she agreed. "But it's true nonetheless." She looked back down at the ledger. "Your biggest problem isn't the debt itself. It's the compounding structure. If Marsh calls the note, he won't call the note." She looked up at him then, with an expression so carefully neutral, it was itself a kind of statement. "Mr. Mercer, Frank Marsh holds a restructured note on the eastern quarter of your land at an interest rate that gives him every incentive to let you fall slightly behind and then call it. Has he given you any reason to trust him?" The silence that fell was thick. "How do you know about note structures?" Wade asked. She closed the ledger carefully, set her hands flat on the cover. "I read a great deal," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at him without blinking. "That trunk of yours," he said. "It's better made than anything I own." She didn't answer. "You came from a church placement agency in Missouri." "That's correct." "How long were you with the agency?" 8 months. "And before that?" She stood up from the table. "I'll be up at 5, she said. "Is that early enough to have breakfast before you go out?" "Miss Hartwell." 5 o'clock, she said, and walked to the room he'd prepared for her and closed the door quietly behind her. Wade stood in his kitchen, holding his own ledger and feeling like he'd just been outmaneuvered, without knowing what game was being played. The first letter arrived 4 days after she did. Jimmy brought it in from the post office in town when he went for supplies, dropped it on the kitchen table without thinking, and Eliza was across the room and had it in her hand before Wade could read the return address. But he saw enough. The envelope was heavy. The paper was good. The postmark said Philadelphia. She put it in her apron pocket. "Business?" Wade asked, not looking up from the harness he was mending at the table. "Personal," she said, and went back to the stove. He didn't ask again, but he watched from the corner of his eye as she slipped out to the back porch after supper with the letter, stood with her back to the yard, and read it in the last light. Her shoulders were not relaxed. They were held with the particular tension of someone bracing against something they'd been expecting. When she came back inside, the letter was gone. He didn't know where. Inside her dress, probably. He didn't ask, but that night he lay awake in his room and turned over what he knew. One trunk. Well made. Eyes that read ledgers like she'd been trained to. A past that lived in different places and produced no family. Letters from Philadelphia that made her shoulders go tight. And a quietness that wasn't the quietness of someone with nothing to say. It was the quietness of someone who had decided carefully and deliberately what not to say. He'd hired or ordered or purchased or whatever word fit the ugly transaction he'd entered into a practical woman, a working woman, a woman with no frills and no pretensions and no inconvenient emotions. But what he'd gotten, he was beginning to suspect, was something else entirely. Something he didn't have a category for yet. Something that read his books better than he did, and knew things about banking structures, and said, "old habit," about financial questions, and received thick envelopes from Philadelphia, and hid them before he could blink. He fell asleep somewhere around midnight and dreamed about numbers. Three days later, she reorganized the feed storage in the barn. He found it when he went out in the morning. What had been a chaotic arrangement of sacks and tools and half-broken equipment stacked wherever there was room had been sorted. Feed by type, tools by function. The damaged equipment separated and stacked neatly against the far wall, with what appeared to be a handwritten inventory list sitting on top. He stood in the barn doorway and looked at it for a long moment. "I hope that's all right," she said from behind him. He turned around. She was carrying 2 buckets of water from the well, one in each hand without visible effort. "You did this last night?" he asked. "And this morning, before you were up?" He looked back at the barn. The inventory list. The neat rows. "How'd you know where everything was?" "I didn't. That's why I made the list, so I could learn." He took one of the buckets from her hand without thinking. She let him without thanking him, or making anything of it. "Jimmy says you asked him about the east fence line yesterday," Wade said. "I did. There's a section down near the creek that's been repaired 6 or 7 times by the look of it. The post is rotten at the base. It's going to fail again unless you replace the post itself." "I know about the post." "Then you know the cattle will get through to the alderman property again when it fails." He set the bucket down. "Miss Hartwell, I've been running this ranch for 20 years. "I know," she said evenly. "And you've kept it going through 2 fever outbreaks, a drought, and a loan restructure. That's not nothing, Mr. Mercer. That's actually remarkable." She paused. "I'm not trying to tell you how to run your ranch. I'm trying to be useful. Isn't that why you brought me here?" He picked the bucket back up and carried it to the trough. "I brought you here to cook and keep house," he said for the second time. "And I do both," she said. "But I'm capable of more if you'll allow it." He stood at the trough for a moment with his back to her, listening to the horses drink. "The east fence post," he said finally. "I'll get to it this week." "I already ordered the lumber," she said. "From Dawson's. I put it on account. I hope that's acceptable." He turned around. She was watching him with that steady gray-green gaze, hands folded in front of her apron, chin level. Not apologetic, not defiant, just present, waiting to see what he would do. "You ordered lumber on my account," he said slowly. "The fence will fail before the week is out. The cattle will get through. You'll spend 3 days rounding them up and repairing damage to the alderman property, which will cost you more in time and goodwill than the lumber did. I calculated it." A beat. "I can show you the calculation if you'd like." Wade Mercer had been a rancher his whole life. He was not a man given to speechlessness. But he stood in the yard of his own ranch on a Tuesday morning in May and found for the second time in a week that he had nothing to say. "How much was the lumber?" he asked finally. $4.60. He nodded once, picked up his hat from the fence post where he'd set it. "I'll be out on the east pasture until noon," he said. "Dinner at 12:30. "Yes, sir," she said without irony. He walked away. Behind him, he heard her pick up the second bucket and carry it to the trough, steady and unhurried. $4.60. Ordered on his account by a woman he'd had for 10 days. And the hell of it was, she was right about the fence. He knew she was right. He'd known about the post for 2 weeks and hadn't gotten to it because there were always 17 other things that needed doing first. She'd just done it. He walked out to the east pasture and tried very hard not to think about what else she might already be seeing that he'd stopped seeing years ago, Dad. The second letter came from New York. He didn't see the return address. This time she was at the table when Jimmy brought it in, and she had it in her hand before he'd even set down the rest of the post. But he heard Jimmy say casually, "That's a fancy envelope," and he saw her face do something very quick and very controlled before it settled back into calm. That evening after supper, he heard her moving in her room long after the house had gone quiet. not pacing, just up. He lay in his own room and listened to the small sounds, the creak of her chair, the rustle of paper, and stared at the dark ceiling, and thought about Philadelphia and New York, and the particular quality of paper that felt different when you picked it up. He thought about the ledger and the feed inventory and the lumber order and the way her mind moved through problems like water finding the fastest route downhill. He thought about old habit. He thought about the trunk. He was not a man who jumped to conclusions. He was a man who watched and waited and let things reveal themselves on their own schedule. He'd learned that from cattle. Mostly you pushed a herd too hard, they scattered. You moved with them patient, and they went where you needed. But something was gathering in the back of his mind. Some shape he couldn't quite see yet, but could feel the edges of. He fell asleep with it unresolved. He woke up the next morning to the smell of coffee and biscuits and the sound of Eliza Hartwell already moving through his kitchen with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been doing hard work long before he'd ever written that letter in February. And he thought, whoever this woman is, she is not what she told me she was. The question that kept him from his breakfast for a long moment, standing in the doorway with the morning light coming in behind him, was not whether he was right. It was whether he was ready for what the answer might be. The fence post went in on a Thursday. Wade had planned to do it himself the way he did everything alone early without ceremony. But when he got to the east pasture at first light with the new post loaded in the wagon, Eliza was already there. She'd brought a spade, a tamping bar, and a bucket of water for setting the earth, and she was digging out the rotten base with the focused economy of someone who had done physical work before and had no illusions about it. He pulled the wagon up and sat there for a moment looking at her. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said, and kept digging. He got down from the wagon. He took the spade from her, not roughly, just steadily, the way you take something from someone when you've decided to do the work yourself, and she stepped back and let him. She held the post while he set it. She tamped the earth while he poured the water. They worked without talking, and the post was in and solid inside 40 minutes. And when it was done, they both stood back and looked at it, the way people look at a thing they've just fixed together. "Good post," she said. "Good idea to replace it," he said grudgingly. She almost smiled. He saw it at the corner of her mouth, the beginning of something, and then it was gone, tucked back where she kept things. They drove back to the ranch house in the same silence they'd driven out in, but it was a different silence than before. Less like two strangers sitting beside each other. More like two people who had just done a thing together and were letting it settle. He noticed that too, filed it away, didn't know what to do with it yet. Pete Alderman came by that Saturday, ostensibly to return a borrowed rope, but really Wade knew to see the bride. Pete was a decent man with a good heart and the subtlety of a dropped hammer. And he had been asking about Eliza Hartwell since the day she'd arrived with the barely concealed fascination of a man whose own wife had left him 4 years ago and who had thoughts about women in general that he tried to disguise as friendly curiosity. Eliza was in the yard when Pete rode up hanging laundry on the line with the brisk efficiency she brought to every task. Pete introduced himself with his hat in his hand and his best smile, and she shook his hand and said it was a pleasure. And Pete, who could talk to anyone about anything for any length of time, fell into comfortable conversation with her immediately. Wade watched from the barn doorway. He told himself he was watching because Pete had a tendency to say things he shouldn't, and the last thing Wade needed was his neighbor asking uncomfortable questions about the ranch's finances. But that wasn't entirely true. "You settling in all right out here?" Pete was asking. "West Texas takes some getting used to." "I'm managing," Eliza said, unpinning a shirt from the basket. "The land is harder than I expected, but harder isn't the same as worse." Pete laughed. "That's a real sensible way to look at it. You from the West yourself?" "No," she said. "East." "Which part?" She shook a pillowcase straight with a clean snap. "Different parts, different times." Pete, to his credit, recognized a closed door when he walked into one and pivoted. "Well, I'll say this. You've done more with old Wade's kitchen garden in 2 weeks than he's done with it in 6 years. Those bean rows are the straightest I've seen." "The soil is good," she said. "It just needed attention." Pete glanced over at Wade with an expression that said, plainly, "Don't you dare let this one go. and Wade looked away and pretended to be interested in the saddle he was supposedly oiling. When Pete finally rode out an hour later, he stopped his horse beside Wade and leaned down. "She's not what I expected," he said quietly. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Something more—" Pete searched for the word. "Provisional. Like somebody between places." He shook his head slowly. "That woman isn't between places, Wade. She's somewhere. She just hasn't told you where yet." He rode off before Wade could answer, which was probably wise because Wade didn't have an answer anyway. Ted. The third letter arrived on a Wednesday, and this one was different. Not in how it arrived. Jimmy brought it with the feed receipts, same as always. But this one was thicker than the others, considerably thicker. And when Eliza picked it up from the table, her hand was not quite steady. Wade was sitting across the room sharpening a knife, and he watched her without watching her, the way he'd gotten practiced at over the past 2 weeks. He saw the stillness that came over her when she looked at the return address. He saw her set the envelope down on the table and put both hands flat beside it, as if she needed to hold something solid. Then she picked it up again, put it in her apron, and walked out to the back porch. This time she was gone longer. 15 minutes, maybe 20. When she came back, her face was composed, but her eyes were doing something different, not upset exactly, but present in a sharper way than usual, like a fire that had been banked down getting air. She went directly to the stove and began preparing supper, and her movements were precise and controlled and slightly faster than usual. Wade set down the knife. "Trouble?" he asked. She didn't pause. "No. You were outside a long time." "I needed air." He picked the knife back up. "Let 3 minutes pass. Then, these letters that keep coming are personal," she said, firmly. Not unkindly, just clearly. "St. I understand that. I'm asking as—" He stopped. "As what, her husband?" They hadn't spoken those words yet, hadn't stood before any preacher. She'd arrived, they'd shaken hands, they'd been living in the same house for 2 weeks, with a formality that suited them both, and a silence that had started to feel uncomfortably like something other than silence. "I'm asking as someone who lives in the same house," he finished. She turned from the stove then, and looked at him directly. "If the letters become relevant to you, I will tell you," she said. "I give you my word on that. And until then they are mine." He held her gaze. She held his right back, and in it was something that was not defiance. Defiance was hot, and this wasn't hot. It was just solid. The look of someone who had drawn a line not out of aggression, but out of simple certainty about where the line belonged. He nodded once, picked up the knife again. "Supper at 6, he said. "Yes," she said, and turned back to the stove. But that night, lying in his room, he thought about the way her hands had not been quite steady. He thought about Philadelphia and New York, and now he'd caught the postmark, this time Boston. 3 cities. 3 separate senders, or the same sender moving around. Letters that came every 4 or 5 days, like something was escalating, like someone was pressing. He thought about Pete's words. "She's somewhere. She just hasn't told you where yet." He thought about the trunk. He got up at 2 in the morning and didn't go near the trunk. He was not that kind of man, but he stood in the kitchen in the dark for a long time, looking at nothing, and asked himself a question he'd been avoiding for 2 weeks. What if she wasn't running from nothing? What if she was running from something very large and very specific, and it was getting closer? He found out more than he intended to on a Friday afternoon, and it happened the way truth usually happened in his experience sideways, when you were looking at something else. He'd ridden into Harlan's Crossing for grain and come back earlier than planned because Dawson's was short on his order. He tied the horse and came in through the kitchen door, and the house was quiet. Eliza was supposed to be in town herself at the dry goods store, but as he passed the hallway, he heard her voice. Low controlled, coming from the small room she used as a sitting space. Not her room, but the front room where the narrow writing desk sat. He wasn't trying to overhear. He stopped because her voice sounded different. Not the brisk, practical voice he'd gotten used to, but something lower and more guarded, like she was weighing every word before it left her mouth. He stood in the hallway and didn't move because moving meant making noise, and by the time he understood he was overhearing something private, he'd already heard too much to pretend otherwise. She wasn't talking to anyone. She was reading aloud quietly, almost under her breath, or, no, not reading. Composing. The way people spoke letters aloud before they wrote them down. "I have received your correspondence," she said very low. "I understand the terms you've outlined. I want to be clear that I have not violated any condition of the arrangement, and I will not be returning to Philadelphia to discuss the matter in person. My position has not changed. The estate can wait. I cannot—" A pause. A breath. "I will not be managed. Not by the firm, not by Mr. Selden, and not by the terms of a will that was written to contain me rather than protect me." Wade didn't breathe. A longer pause. Then, "I am where I need to be. That is all anyone needs to know." He heard the scratch of pen on paper she'd moved from composing to writing. He took 3 very careful steps backward out of the hallway and stood in the kitchen doing something he hadn't done since he was a boy, listening to his parents argue through a closed door. He stood very still and tried to make sense of what he'd heard. The estate, the firm, a man named Selden, a will, Philadelphia. He walked out to the barn and stood with his horse for a long time, running his hand along the animal's neck, the way he did when he needed to think. And he thought about a woman who walked into a failing Texas ranch and read a ledger like a lawyer, and knew about loan note structures and ordered fence lumber on account without asking, and received letters from 3 cities that made her hands tremble. No family, she'd told Jimmy. Grew up in different places. But you didn't write letters to an estate firm if you had no family. You didn't have a will drawn up to contain you if there was nothing to contain. He stood there until supper time. When he walked back into the house, Eliza was in the kitchen, calm and efficient, stirring a pot of something that smelled like venison stew, and she looked up at him with her usual steady regard. "You're back early," she said. "Dawson's was short," he said. "Smells good. Should be ready in an hour." He sat down at the table. He folded his hands. He looked at her for a long moment, at the line of her back, at the efficiency of her movements, at the particular quality of self-possession she carried everywhere she went. And he made a decision. He would not confront her. Not yet. Not like that. But he was going to pay attention in a way he hadn't been paying attention before. Because whatever she was hiding, it wasn't small. And it wasn't staying hidden for much longer. He could feel it the way he felt weather coming, not seeing it yet, but feeling the pressure change. Something was coming for Eliza Hartwell, and it was coming to his ranch. The conversation that broke things open didn't happen the way he expected. He'd been bracing for a confrontation, something tense and deliberate. Instead, it happened on a Sunday evening after a long day when they were both tired, and the tiredness had worn down the careful distances they usually kept. She'd been working the kitchen garden most of the afternoon, and he'd been repairing the roof of the small equipment shed, and they'd ended up on the back porch at the same time by accident, both of them needing the air, and the sun was going down. The way Texas suns went down, completely dramatically without reservation, and neither of them had said anything for several minutes. Then she said, "You've had this land a long time." "Born on it," he said. "More or less." "What does that mean, more or less?" "My father started the ranch when I was 3. I don't remember not being here." She was quiet for a moment. "That must be a strange thing to have." "What land?" "Somewhere that's just always been yours, that you don't have to explain or justify. It's just there." He looked at her sideways. Her face was turned toward the horizon, and in the low evening light, she looked younger than 24 and older than it at the same time. Something in the line of her jaw was doing what he'd come to recognize as her version of feeling something she didn't plan to say. "You've never had that," he said. It wasn't a question. "No." "Where did you grow up, actually?" A pause. Long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, "My father had business in many cities. We moved frequently. After he died, she stopped. How old were you? 15. And your mother? She died when I was 7. He nodded, said nothing, because he knew what it was to lose people young and have it change the whole shape of you. He didn't need to make conversation about it. After he died, she said, picking up where she'd left off with the steadiness of someone who had learned to talk about painful things without unraveling, there were arrangements made. There are always arrangements made when a man of business dies and leaves things behind. Lawyers, partners, men who knew him, who had plans. Plans for you, plans for what I was connected to. She looked down at her hands. I was 15 years old and I was very useful to several people who had never previously noticed I existed. Wade felt something old and hard move in his chest. What kind of useful? She glanced at him, then just briefly, just a flicker. The kind where you get married to the right man and the right man gains access to the right accounts. He was quiet for a moment. Selden, he said before he could stop himself. The silence that followed was absolute. She went very still. You heard me, she said. Not a question. Not angry either, just flat the way the air went flat before lightning. He didn't try to deny it. I didn't mean to. I came back early. I should have made more noise. She looked straight ahead at the darkening horizon. Her hands were very still in her lap. He waited. Arthur Selden. She said finally, the name coming out with the controlled precision of someone saying something they've said 1,000 times in their own head. He was a business partner of my father's. He's 22 years older than I am. He's been engaged to me on paper since I was 16. It was written into the terms of my father's estate. A beat. I did not agree to it. I was not asked. Wade said nothing. He'd learned that saying nothing was sometimes the most useful thing you could do. There is money, she said very quietly. A great deal of it. Tied to my father's company. Hartwell Trading. I am the sole heir. She paused. And every lawyer and trustee and business partner connected to my father's estate needs me either married to Arthur Selden or declared incompetent, because those are the two conditions under which they retain control of the assets, rather than surrendering them to me outright on my 25th birthday. The quiet that followed was large and full of things. When is your 25th birthday? Wade asked. November, she said. 7 months from now. He let that sit. 7 months. The letters. 3 cities. The pressure that had been building in those envelopes. They're trying to get you back before November, he said. Yes. And Selden is part of that. Arthur Selden is the center of it. If I marry him before November, the control of the assets transfers jointly. If I refuse and reach November as an unmarried woman... She stopped. Swallowed once. I receive full control. The trustees lose their leverage. Selden loses everything he's been waiting 9 years for. Wade looked at his hands on the porch railing. Big, worn, scarred hands, the hands of a man who had worked his way into debt on land that might not survive the year. He thought about the irony of it with a kind of dark, distant wonder. He'd ordered a poor woman because he needed practical help. He'd gotten a woman with more money attached to her name than he would earn in 100 lifetimes. Why here, he said. Why a mail-order arrangement? Why Texas? Because no one would think to look here, she said simply. Arthur Selden looks for me in cities, in hotels, in the circles my father moved in. He doesn't look for me. She glanced around at the back porch, the yard, the dark shapes of the barn and bunkhouse in the evening air. Here. But the letters found you. The firm has resources. They found me through the agency. Her jaw tightened. I have perhaps another month before Selden himself follows the letters. Wade absorbed this. All of it. The shape of it. The weight. The agency knew who you were, he asked. The director knew. She's a woman who helps women in difficult situations. She's done it for years under the cover of placement services. A small, complicated pause. She thought a genuine marriage arrangement might offer some legal protection. A married woman controlling her own estate is harder to contest than an unmarried one. He looked at her. So you answered my letter. I answered several letters, she said, with the honesty of someone past the point of polishing the truth. Yours was the most straightforward. You said what you wanted without pretending to want something else. A very small pause. I found that restful. He almost laughed. Of all the things his awkward, practical, graceless letter might have accomplished, he had not considered that its greatest virtue was honesty. I need to ask you something, he said. All right. Does this change why you're here? The work you've been doing, the ledger, the barn, the fence post, is that... He stopped. Started again. Is that about the ranch? Or is it about making yourself hard to dislodge? She was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that he knew she was giving the question the full weight it deserved. Both, she said. At first, both. She looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that was different from the careful neutrality she usually kept, something more direct, more unguarded. But the ranch is real, Mr. Mercer. Your problems are real. And She stopped. I'm not accustomed to sitting still when I can see what needs doing. He nodded slowly. I should have told you sooner, she said. I know that. For the first time she looked uncertain. Not weak, not fragile, but uncertain the way honest people look when they're admitting something they're not proud of. I was afraid that if you knew you'd send me back. Wade Mercer sat on his back porch in the dark, with that sentence hanging in the air between them, and felt something complicated move through him that he wasn't ready to name. I wouldn't have sent you back, he said. You didn't know that then? No, he admitted. I didn't. The night settled in around them, and neither of them moved, and after a long time she said very quietly, What happens now? He didn't answer right away, because the honest answer was that he didn't know. A month ago, he'd thought he knew exactly what this arrangement was, and what it would cost him, and what he'd get from it. A practical transaction between two people who needed different things from the same deal. He didn't think that anymore. What happens now, he said finally, is that we fix that section of roof on the south side of the barn before the summer rains come, and we move the cattle to the north pasture next week, and we figure out the rest as it comes. She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once. All right, she said. One more thing, he said. Yes. From now on, you don't have to hide the letters. She went very still. Then slowly she exhaled. Not dramatically, not with great visible relief, but with the quiet, deep release of someone who has been holding something for a very long time without letting themselves notice how heavy it was. Thank you, she said. He nodded, got up from the porch, went inside. He lay in the dark for a long time that night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about 7 months and Arthur Selden, and a woman who'd picked his letter out of however many because it was honest, and thinking about the look on her face when she said, I was afraid you'd send me back. He'd told her he wouldn't have. He meant it. But what he hadn't said, what he wasn't ready to say yet, wasn't sure he understood yet, was that somewhere in the past 2 weeks between the fence post and the feed inventory and the ledger and the back porch and the Sunday evening light, something had shifted in him that had nothing to do with practical arrangements. And it scared him considerably more than the debt. The week after the porch conversation, something changed between them that neither of them named. It wasn't softness exactly. Wade wasn't a soft man, and Eliza wasn't a soft woman, and they hadn't suddenly become different people because the truth had come out on a Sunday evening. But there was less weight in the air. Less of that careful, measured distance that had made every conversation feel like two people negotiating the terms of a treaty. She left a letter on the kitchen table one morning. Not to him, not addressed to anyone, just sitting there, open beside the coffee pot, as if she'd set it down while pouring her cup and simply not picked it back up. He understood what it was. An offering. The first one. He poured his own coffee and stood there and read it without touching it. It was from the law firm, Calloway and Briggs, Philadelphia. The language was formal and dense, and threaded through with the particular coldness of legal correspondence that wants to sound reasonable while threatening you. The summary stripped of its careful phrasing was this: Eliza Hartwell was requested to return to Philadelphia at her earliest convenience to discuss the terms of the Hartwell estate. Her continued absence was noted with concern. Mr. Arthur Selden had expressed willingness to be accommodating regarding the arrangement. The firm trusted she understood that her cooperation would be in everyone's best interests. Everyone's best interests. Wade set down his coffee cup with more force than he intended. When Eliza came back into the kitchen, he was still standing at the table. She looked at him, then at the letter. "Accommodating," he said. "That's their word for it, yes." Selden wrote that. Selden dictated it. Calloway wrote it. She picked the letter up and folded it with the ease of someone who had handled 100 like it. Arthur doesn't dirty his own hands with correspondence unless he has to. "What does he look like?" Wade asked. She glanced up at him, slightly surprised by the question. Tall, well-dressed, silver at his temples, he was proud of that. He considered it distinguished. She paused. "He has the kind of face that photographs well, and says nothing true." Wade nodded slowly. "And how far away is he?" "Geographically Philadelphia." She tucked the letter into her apron. "In terms of intent, he's been here the whole time." He thought about that phrase all morning while he worked the north pasture moving the cattle the way she'd suggested. She was right about the grass, she'd been right about most things, which he'd stopped being surprised by, and started simply factoring in. He thought about Selden's face that photographs well, and says nothing true, and thought about the law firm, and thought about the word accommodating, and he felt an anger building in him that was low and even, and the kind that didn't go away fast. He'd known men like that. Not exactly like that he didn't run in the circles that produced Arthur Selden's, but the type. Men who phrased control as consideration. Men who called possession protection. Men who had never once in their lives done a piece of work that left dirt under their fingernails, and who felt because of that they had a right to the things that harder men had built. Jimmy found him at the far end of the north pasture, around noon, riding out with his lunch pail and the information that there was a man at the ranch house asking for Wade. Wade's first thought was Selden. His chest went tight. "What kind of man?" he asked. "Town kind," Jimmy said. "Suit and hat. Came in a buggy." Not Selden, then. Selden would come in something more impressive than a hired buggy. Wade rode back to the ranch house and found Frank Marsh standing in the yard, hat in hand, with the smile that Wade had come to think of as the bank smile, pleasant on the surface, patient underneath the smile of a man who understood that time was always on his side. "Wade," Marsh said warmly. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "You are," Wade said, dismounting. "What do you need, Frank?" Marsh's smile didn't flicker. "Just a friendly visit. Wanted to check in on how things are going out here. Hear you've had some changes." His eyes moved to the house, and Wade knew he was looking for Eliza, and felt a hot dislike of the man that was sharper than usual. "My wife is inside." Wade said the word wife arriving in his mouth before he'd consciously decided to use it, but once said, sitting there solid and apparently permanent. If Marsh noticed the slight imprecision of the term, he didn't show it. "Wonderful. I hope she's settling in well." He turned his hat in his hands. "I wanted to talk to you about the note, Wade. The end of quarter review is coming up, and there are some concerns I need to flag." "What concerns?" "The cattle numbers are still low. The collateral calculation on the eastern quarter has shifted." Marsh's voice was all regret and practicality, the voice of a man delivering bad news he personally had nothing to do with. "The board has asked me to discuss the possibility of an accelerated payment schedule." Wade went very still. "Accelerated. It's not my preference, you understand. I've been your advocate in that room, Wade. I want you to know that. But the numbers are what they are, and the board, how accelerated." Marsh named a figure and a timeline, and it landed like a boot on a man's chest. 6 months. An amount that Wade could not produce in 6 months if every cow on the property doubled in value overnight. He stood in his own yard and looked at Frank Marsh's regretful, patient face and understood with a clarity that felt like cold water that this was not a friendly visit. This was a calculation. Marsh had been watching the Mercer Ranch for 2 years. watching it struggle, letting the interest compound, restructuring just enough to keep Wade technically solvent, while the gap between what he owed and what he had widened quietly, invisibly, until now it was wide enough to fall through. "I'll need to look at the figures," Wade said. "Of course, take your time." Marsh put his hat back on. "I'll expect to hear from you by the end of the month." He paused, smiled once more. "Congratulations on the marriage, by the way. Nice to see the ranch with some life in it." He got back in his buggy and drove away, and Wade stood in the yard until the dust settled and then turned and walked into the house. Eliza was at the stove. She took one look at his face and turned the burner down. "Marsh," she said. It wasn't a question. "How did you—" "I saw him from the window." She wiped her hands on her apron. "What did he want?" He told her. The accelerated schedule, the figure, the timeline. He laid it out flatly, the way you laid out a wound when someone needed to understand how bad it was, not for drama, just for accuracy. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "He's been planning this," she said. "I know. The restructure in January wasn't about the board, it was about positioning. He needed the interest compounded to a certain level before he could justify the accelerated call to whoever he's answering to." Wade looked at her. "Marsh answers to the board. Marsh answers to whoever holds the largest stake in Harlan's first savings." She met his eyes. "Do you know who that is?" He didn't. He'd never had cause to find out. His business with the bank had always been with Marsh directly, and he'd thought of the board as a vague collective authority somewhere behind the man. "I can find out," she said quietly. He stared at her. "How?" "I know how to request a corporate filing record. Any registered bank has to disclose its major shareholders through the State Banking Commission." She paused. "My father's company operated in 12 states. I learned a great many things about how money moves between institutions before I was old enough to drive it myself." Wade sat down in the kitchen chair. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them. Those scarred, worn hands that had built and repaired and worked for 20 years and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not defeat. Something older and quieter than defeat. The sensation of a man realizing that the game he's been playing has had rules he didn't know about. "Tell me what you need," he said. But she wrote 3 letters that afternoon and sent Jimmy to town to post them with the authority of a woman who had been organizing information and dispatching correspondence since she was a teenager, managing her father's household in his frequent absences. Jimmy, who by now accepted Eliza's requests with the easy deference of someone who has recognized competence without needing to analyze it, wrote out without comment. While she wrote, Wade sat at the table with the bank documents he'd retrieved from the cabinet. All of them, every letter and contract and restructure, noticed things he'd been avoiding looking at too closely, and spread them out and went through them one by one. It was not pleasant. It was like performing surgery on yourself without anesthetic. But she'd asked to see them all, and so he put them in order and waited. When she sat down across from him and began to read, he watched her face the way he'd watched it that first night over the ledger. The same focused quiet, the same movement behind the eyes that meant the gears were turning. 20 minutes in, she stopped. "Wade," she said. The use of his first name without the preceding formality, she'd been moving toward it gradually, but hadn't fully arrived until now, made him look up sharply. "This clause," she said, turning the January restructure document to face him and pointing to a paragraph near the bottom. "Did Marsh explain this to you when you signed?" He looked at it. Legal language. Dense. He summarized it. "What did he say it meant?" "That if I fell more than 60 days behind on payments, the bank had the right to begin foreclosure proceedings." She shook her head slowly. "That's what it says in the first sentence of the clause. The second sentence says something else. It says that in the event of a payment default, the bank may at its discretion offer the property for private sale prior to public auction." She looked at him. "Do you understand what that means?" He did. The air went out of him slowly, steadily, like a tire with a nail in it. It means Marsh doesn't have to put the land up for public auction if I default. He can sell it directly, to whoever he chooses. At whatever price the bank determines is fair market value, she said. Without your input. Without a public process that might produce a competing buyer. The silence that followed had weight. He already has a buyer, Wade said. Not a question, a conclusion. Almost certainly. She sat back. The question is who? He thought about it for a long moment. Then something cold moved through him, a thought arriving fully formed, the way the worst thoughts do without warning. Eliza, he said carefully. When Selden sends letters, when he's trying to locate you, what resources does he have access to? She went very still. He's a business partner of a dead man's estate, Wade continued. He's got lawyers. He's got financial connections in Philadelphia and New York and Boston. He held her gaze. He's been trying to find you for how long? 8 months since you left. 8 months, she said very quietly. And in 8 months, a man with those resources and that much to gain. He stopped. Let her follow the line. She followed it. He watched her face as she did, watched the moment the possibility landed, and the way she absorbed it, not with panic, not with visible fear, but with the controlled, precise attention of someone whose mind was already running ahead to the implications. Arthur knows people in Texas banking, she said slowly. His company had cattle investments in the late 1860s. He liquidated them, but the relationships... She stopped. Started again. He would know who to contact, who could be useful to him. A local banker, Wade said, who has a struggling rancher on the hook and who could position himself to acquire the land at a reduced price, and who might have... He chose the next word carefully, outside encouragement to accelerate the timeline. She stood up, walked to the window, stood with her back to him, hands on the sill, and he could see the line of her shoulders and the way they were working against something, against the full realization of it, against the scale of what was being done and how far back it went. He found me, she said. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness cost something. He found me, and he didn't come for me directly, because coming directly would risk me running again. So he... She stopped. He pulled the ground out from under the place you're standing, Wade said. She turned around. Her face was not broken. Eliza Hartwell didn't break, but there was something raw in it, something uncovered that he'd never seen before in 4 weeks of close proximity. I brought this to you, she said. I brought this to your door. You didn't know. I should have considered. You were trying to survive, he said sharply. More sharply than he intended, but the sharpness seemed to reach her in a way that softness wouldn't have. You were a 24-year-old woman running from a man who wanted to use you as a financial instrument. You found a place to land. That's not something you apologize for. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. Wade, she said. What? I have money. The statement fell into the room and sat there. I know, he said. I have enough money to... She stopped. Started again more carefully. My personal funds, the portion I've controlled since my 21st birthday, separate from the estate assets I have access to them. They're in a private account in a bank that Calloway and Briggs don't know about, and Selden has never found. She met his eyes. I could pay off the note, the entire note, today if I could get to the telegraph. The silence went long and deep. No, Wade said. Wade, no. He said it quietly, but without any give in it. This is not charity. I said no. She squared her shoulders. And here was the version of Eliza Hartwell that he'd been catching glimpses of from the beginning. Not the careful, contained woman who weighed every word before she said it, but the one underneath, the one who had looked at a law firm full of men trying to own her and said, I will not be managed, and she was not small at all. You listen to me, she said, and her voice had an edge to it now, clean and precise as a knife blade. You are about to lose this land because Arthur Selden reached his hand across 1,000 miles and put it in your business to get to me. That is not your failure. That is not your debt in any real sense. That is a man using you as a weapon against me, and I am not going to stand here and watch it happen while I have the means to stop it." Wade pushed back from the table and stood up. They were the same height he'd noticed that before, but it struck him now differently, eye to eye, jaw set on both sides. "And what happens after?" he said. "When the note's paid and your money's in my land, what does that make you? What does it make me?" "It makes you a man who kept his ranch," she said. "It makes me a man kept by his wife's fortune," he said. "And there's not a soul in this county who wouldn't know it, and not a day that would pass that I wouldn't know it, and you understand that or you don't." She opened her mouth, closed it, and in her eyes he saw something shift, not capitulation, but comprehension. She was a smart enough woman to understand what she'd walked into. Pride was not vanity in a man like Wade Mercer. It was structural. It was the thing that had kept him working this land through drought and fever and debt, the thing that had kept him from walking away, when walking away would have been the rational choice. You didn't pull that out of a man and expect him to be the same man. The tension between them held for another long moment. Then Jimmy knocked on the kitchen door and stuck his head in with the uncomplicated timing of a 16-year-old who didn't read rooms well. "There's a rider coming up the South Road," he said. "Fancy horse, fancier than anything from around here." Wade and Eliza looked at each other. "How many?" Wade asked, his eyes still on her. "Just one," Jimmy said. "But there's a second buggy behind. Looks like it might be carrying luggage." The word luggage sat in the air like a dropped stone. Eliza's face did not change, but her eyes did. Something moved through them, not fear, because she didn't fear Arthur Selden the way a person fears violence, but the particular dread of a person who has been running and has just heard the footsteps stop outside the door. "He's here," she said. "You don't know that," Jimmy started. "Jimmy," Wade said, "go get my rifle and put it in the kitchen. Then take the horses around to the north side and keep them ready. Don't let anyone see you doing it." Jimmy disappeared. Wade looked at Eliza. "You don't go outside," he said. "Wade, not yet. Not until we know what we're dealing with." He picked up his hat from the peg by the door, put it on, pulled the brim level. "I'll go see who it is." "And if it's Selden," he paused at the door, turned back to look at her over his shoulder, at this woman who had come off a stagecoach 4 weeks ago, with one trunk, and a gaze that looked straight through him, and who had turned out to be the most complicated and least manageable and strangest thing that had ever walked onto his property, including the fever cattle and the rotten fence post and Frank Marsh. "Then we'll find out what kind of man he is," Wade said. "And he'll find out what kind of man I am." He walked out. The rider was close enough now that he could see the quality of the horse. She was right. Fancier than anything from around here. He stood in the yard with his thumbs in his belt and the June sun burning the back of his neck, and he waited. Whatever was coming up that road had been set in motion 9 years ago by a dead man's will and a business partner who'd mistaken a young girl's silence for submission. It had moved through lawyers and letters and banknotes and a church placement agency in Missouri, and wound up here in the dust of his yard in front of a man who'd written a letter in February asking for a plow, and gotten something else entirely. He heard the kitchen door open behind him and felt without turning that Eliza had come out anyway. Of course she had. She was not a woman who stayed where she was put. He didn't tell her to go back inside. They stood side by side in the yard and waited for Arthur Selden to come to them. And in that moment, standing together in the dirt in the sun, on ground that was not entirely his, and a future that was not what either of them had planned, Wade Mercer thought about what she'd said on the porch. About having a place that was just always yours, that you didn't have to explain or justify. He'd had that. He understood what it meant to have it and to feel it threatened. He understood for the first time with a vividness that surprised him that she'd never had it once in her life. And he thought she should. He thought she should have it here. And that thought, arriving without permission, settled in his chest like a fence post set in good earth, solid deep and not going anywhere. The rider reached the gate. Arthur Selden dismounted like a man who had never once in his life worried about whether the ground would hold him. He was exactly what Eliza had described: tall, well-dressed, silver at the temples, with a face that arranged itself naturally into an expression of reasonable concern. He looked like the kind of man who chaired committees and gave speeches at civic dinners, and was described by other men as sound. He handed his reins to the man who'd climbed down from the buggy behind him, a hired hand, city-soft, who had no business being in Texas heat, and walked toward the gate with the unhurried confidence of someone arriving at a place that already belonged to him in every way that mattered to him. He stopped when he saw Eliza standing beside Wade. Something moved across his face, not surprise exactly, more like the expression of a chess player who has just watched his opponent make a move that was unexpected, but not in the end a problem. "Eliza," he said warmly, as if they'd parted last week on good terms, as if 8 months hadn't passed with her running and him hunting. "You look well." "Mr. Selden," she said. Her voice was flat as a board. Selden's eyes moved to Wade with the particular quality of attention that men like him gave to obstacles, assessing, calculating, not hostile, because hostility would be inefficient. "You must be Mr. Mercer," he said, extending his hand. Wade looked at the hand, did not take it. "I know who you are," he said. "State your business." Selden's hand dropped without embarrassment. "Of course. I've come for Eliza. There are matters at home that require her attention, matters that have waited quite long enough. I'd like to speak with her privately if you don't mind." "I do mind," Wade said. A brief pause. "I'm sorry. I said I mind. Whatever you have to say to my wife, you can say it here." The word landed the same way it had with Marsh, deliberate, solid, impossible to walk back. Selden's eyes moved from Wade to Eliza and back again, and Wade watched the man process the information. Recalibrate, decide on his approach. "I see," Selden said pleasantly. "Well, in that case, Eliza, the firm has been patient. Callaway and Briggs have made every effort to accommodate your concerns about the arrangement. But your father's estate cannot remain in suspension indefinitely. There are creditors. There are employees who depend on the trading company. There are legal obligations that are frankly approaching a critical threshold." He paused. "I'm not here to pressure you. I'm here because I care about what happens to you and to everything your father built." Eliza said nothing for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was careful and cold. "My father built Hartwell Trading over 30 years. He did not build it so that you could administer it in perpetuity while I waited for your permission to take what is mine. That's not— You have been engaged to me on paper since I was 16 years old." Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. "You have never once asked me a single question about what I wanted. You have expressed to lawyers and trustees and banking contacts what you believe is best for me and for the estate. You have had men follow me across 3 states. She stepped forward slightly. "And you have, I've recently learned, reached into the financial affairs of this ranch through a local banker you've been communicating with for at least 6 months. Selden's pleasant expression didn't collapse. It adjusted, became more serious, more regretful. "Eliza, I don't know what you've—" "Frank Marsh," Wade said. The name produced the only genuine reaction Selden had shown since he arrived. Not guilt. Men like Selden didn't do guilt, but a quick, precise recalculation behind the eyes. He looked at Wade with the new attention of someone who has underestimated the terrain. "I'm not familiar with—" "Don't," Wade said. "One word. Quiet. Don't do that. I've got a restructured loan with terms designed to put me under on a schedule, and you've got an interest in this land being available because this is where she landed, and you want her moved." He held the man's gaze. "I've been a rancher my whole life, Selden. I know what it looks like when someone's trying to move livestock by cutting off their water." The silence that followed was the longest one yet. Selden looked at both of them. His face did the thing that faces like his did. When performance became unnecessary, it simplified. The warmth drained out of it, and what was left was just the structure underneath. Precise. Patient. Absolutely certain of itself. "Mr. Mercer," he said. "You're an intelligent man. I can see that. So I'll be honest with you. because I think you'll appreciate it more than the alternative." He straightened his coat. "Eliza's estate is worth more than this county's annual output. She is by any measure one of the wealthiest women east of the Mississippi. The Hartwell fortune has interests in shipping textiles and rail infrastructure. It is not a small thing. It is not a thing that can simply remain here." His eyes moved around the yard with a delicacy that was itself a kind of insult. "And you must understand on some level that this is not where it belongs." Wade felt Eliza go rigid beside him. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on Selden. "Where it belongs," Wade said slowly, "is with her. She is 24 years old and fully capable of deciding where she stands," Wade said. "She's been deciding things since she was 15 and nobody was asking her opinion. She decided to leave Philadelphia. She decided where to go. She decided what work to take up. She's been deciding things around here that I didn't even know needed deciding, and she's been right every time." He took one step forward. "So I'll tell you what I think, since you're being honest. I think you rode out here expecting to find a woman who'd been living rough in a struggling man's house for a month and would be ready to come back to comfort. I think you expected me to be grateful for whatever offer you'd decided to make me. And I think you are standing in my yard right now realizing that neither of those things is true." Selden looked at him for a long moment, then at Eliza. "Come home," he said, and for the first time there was something almost human in his voice. Not warmth but need, which was different and less appealing. "Eliza, this is not your life. Whatever you've convinced yourself about this place, whatever this arrangement is, it isn't real. It's a document you signed out of desperation, and it can be dissolved. Come home. Take control of the estate properly with the firm's assistance, and all of this, a gesture that encompassed everything, goes away." "The firm's assistance," Eliza repeated. "Yes, meaning your assistance." He paused. "We have a long history. We have a legal document my father signed when I was 16, she said. "That is not a history, that is a transaction." Her voice remained perfectly steady. "I will tell you once, Arthur, only once because you came a long way and you were at least honest at the end. I am not going back to Philadelphia. I am not marrying you. When November comes, I will take control of the Hartwell estate as my father's will specifies with or without the cooperation of Calloway and Briggs. And if you have been communicating with Frank Marsh about this property, I will find out the details of those communications and I will use them." She looked at him with those gray-green eyes that had read Wade's ledger on the first night and ordered lumber the next morning and set fence posts in the dawn light without being asked. "Do you understand me?" Selden was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to Wade with the expression of a man making one last reasonable offer. "Mr. Mercer, I'm prepared to settle your bank debt in full, immediately, in exchange for—" "No," Wade said. A straightforward conversation with Eliza privately, without "no." Wade said it again with the same flat final quality. "You're not buying a conversation with my wife. You're not buying anything here, and I'd like you off my property." Selden left. Not immediately. Men like him didn't leave immediately because leaving immediately would look like losing, and so he stood a moment longer, saying things about legal obligations and the firm's patience and Eliza's well-being that were really about composing himself and not about any of the things he claimed. But eventually he got back on his horse, and the buggy turned around, and the dust of the South Road rose and settled, and they were gone. The yard was very quiet. Jimmy appeared from around the corner of the barn. He'd been listening, Wade knew, with the transparent subtlety of a teenager, and looked between them. "Should I still keep the horses ready?" he asked. "Put them back," Wade said. Jimmy disappeared. Eliza stood in the yard without moving. Wade stood beside her and didn't speak because he'd learned by now that she processed things in a particular order. First the practical implications, then the emotional weight of it, and she didn't like to be interrupted midway through either. After a long moment she said, "He'll go to Marsh next." "I know. He has enough leverage there to accelerate the call on the note. if Marsh formally demands payment. I know Eliza. She turned and looked at him. In her face was something he hadn't seen before, not the raw vulnerability of the porch conversation, but something harder and more honest than that. Something that had been tested in the last 20 minutes and come through still standing, but not without cost. You called me your wife, she said. I did. We're not. She stopped. We haven't. We haven't. I know what we are and what we aren't, he said. I used the word because it was the right word for what I needed to say in that moment. If it bothers you, say so. She looked at him for a moment. It doesn't bother me, she said. He nodded once. Good. The distance between them in the yard felt different now than it had that first day when he'd stood at the depot and she'd looked straight through him. Then it had been the distance of two strangers at the beginning of a transaction. Now it was something else, the distance of two people standing on the same side of something which was a different geography entirely. He'll come back, she said. Not himself. He'll send the firm. They'll file some kind of legal obstruction, try to challenge my competency, my choices, something. It's what they do. She pressed her lips together. And if Marsh calls the note at the same time, then we've got two fires at once, Wade said. Yes. Can you get to that telegraph today? The account you mentioned, the one they don't know about? She looked at him sharply. You said no. I said no to charity, he said. I'm asking something different now. She waited. I'm asking if you can get access to funds that belong to you, not to your father's estate, not to anything Selden can touch, and use them to pay off this note before Marsh gets the chance to call it. He held her gaze. I'll pay you back. Every dollar. In writing with interest on a schedule we agree on. It's a loan. Between... He stopped. Started again. Between people who have decided to handle this together. Something moved through her face, quick and warm, and almost immediately controlled, but not before he saw it. You'd accept a loan from me, she said carefully. I'd accept a loan from anyone who was willing to make one on fair terms when a man needed it, he said. The fact that it's you doesn't change what it is. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you're a stubborn man, Wade Mercer. Yes, he agreed. The terms would need to be written out properly. We'll write them out tonight. And you understand that paying off the note removes Marsh's immediate leverage, but it doesn't end this. Selden still has 6 months until November. He'll find another angle. I know. And when he does, we'll handle it, Wade said, simply. Not as a promise of something easy, but as a statement of fact. The way he said things about fence posts and cattle rotations and the work that needed doing. We'll handle it. Together. As if that was just the obvious shape of things now. She looked at him for a long time in the yard. The sun was past its peak, and the light had gone from brutal to something more honest. And in that light, she looked the age she was, and also older. And also for just a moment, in a way, he couldn't fully account for something that wasn't either of those things. Something that was just her. Just the actual person who'd been in his house for a month, working beside him, eating at his table, reading his ledger, ordering his lumber, fixing his land. All right, she said. Tonight we write the terms. Tomorrow morning I go to the telegraph. Jimmy can drive you. I'd rather you did, she said, and then looked as if she hadn't entirely planned to say it. He didn't make anything of it. Fine, he said. I'll drive you. They walked back inside. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table with paper and ink and worked out the terms of the loan. The way they'd worked out everything directly without sentiment, with the practical precision of two people who had learned to respect each other's intelligence. She named a reasonable interest rate. He argued it down. She said it was already below what any bank would offer. He said that was the point. They went back and forth twice and settled on a figure, and he wrote it down in his own hand, and she wrote it down in hers, and they both signed both copies. Jimmy came in for supper and looked at the papers on the table, and at the two of them sitting across from each other, and made a face of profound 16-year-old discomfort. Do I want to know? He said. No. Wade and Eliza said at the same moment. Jimmy ate his supper and went to the bunkhouse. Eliza cleared the table. Wade poured 2 cups of coffee and set one at her place without asking. She sat back down and wrapped both hands around the cup and said without preamble, "He'll try Pete Alderman next." Wade frowned. "Pete. He'll look for anyone with influence in this county who might be persuaded to make life difficult. Pete owns the neighboring property and has a longer history here than most. If Selden approaches him, Pete won't take money from someone like Selden. He might not need money. He might just need a sympathetic ear and a reasonable-sounding story." She looked at Wade. "You should talk to him, before Selden does." He nodded slowly. She was right. He knew Pete knew how Pete's mind worked, knew how Pete responded to smooth-talking men from the East who made everything sound like just good sense. If Selden got to Pete first, with whatever version of the story served him best. "I'll ride over tomorrow after the telegraph," he said. "Good." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "There's something else." He waited. "The letters I received, the early ones from Calloway and Briggs, they referenced a third party. Someone who'd been providing information about my location. Not Marsh. Someone closer." She looked up. "Someone who knew which placement agency I'd used." The implication settled over Wade like a weight. "The director," he said slowly. "The woman who—" "No," Eliza said quickly. "Not her. She wouldn't. But someone with access to the agency's records. Someone who knew where the records were kept." She paused. "There was a clerk, a young man who'd been hired 6 months before I came through. He was attentive in a way that felt slightly wrong." Her jaw tightened. "I didn't follow up on it. I should have." "Can you find out? I can write to the director. She'll know if anyone approached him." She pressed her lips together. "If Selden has had someone watching the agency, if he knew where I was going before I even arrived—" "Then he's been patient," Wade said. "More patient than I thought." "That's who he is," she said quietly. "Arthur doesn't chase. He positions. He waits. He lets things develop until the situation resolves itself in his favor." Her eyes met Wade's. He thought that's what this was. He thought time and pressure and Frank Marsh and this loan would resolve the situation for him. He thought I'd run out of options and come back. "He miscalculated," Wade said. "Yes," she said. "He didn't account for—" She stopped. "For what?" She looked at her coffee cup, then back at him. "For the fact that I stopped running," she said. "At some point in the last few weeks, I stopped running and I didn't notice until just now." A small pause. "That hasn't happened since I was 15. Wade didn't say anything. He held his coffee cup and felt the weight of that sentence and let it be what it was without trying to make it smaller or larger than it was. "You should sleep," he said finally. "It's a long drive tomorrow, and you'll want your head clear for the telegraph office." She nodded, stood up, carried her cup to the dry sink. At the door to the hallway, she stopped. "Wade." "What?" She turned halfway. "What you said to him. About me deciding things." She paused. "About me being right." She looked at him with those steady eyes. "No one has said that about me to someone else's face before. Not in front of me like that." He didn't know what to say to that. It struck him as such a plain and simple thing. Of course, she'd been right. She was almost always right. That was a fact as basic as the fence post and the cattle rotation, that the idea of no one having said it before seemed like an accounting error. A mistake in the ledger that needed correcting. "Well," he said. "You were." She nodded once, and went to her room. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after that, looking at the 2 signed copies of their loan agreement sitting on the table. 2 signatures, 2 copies. The formal written record of 2 people who had entered a transaction and come out the other side of something else entirely, without ever stopping to name what it was. He thought about Selden riding away down the South Road, and the particular quality of that man's face when he'd realized he'd miscalculated. He thought about Marsh and the accelerated note and the clause about private sale, and the long, patient architecture of a scheme that had been designed to remove Eliza Hartwell from the only place she'd ever stopped running. He thought about what it would mean, what it would actually concretely mean to face everything coming at them in the next 6 months. The legal challenges Selden would mount, the financial pressure, the slow grinding campaign of a man with resources and patience and no conscience about using both. And he thought about what he'd felt standing in the yard beside her when Selden came through the gate. Not obligation. Not the practical satisfaction of a transaction being protected. Something older and more inconvenient than either of those things. Something that had put the word wife in his mouth without his permission and kept it there even after Selden left. He folded his copy of the loan agreement, put it in the cabinet where he kept important documents, put it beside the deed to the land and the letter of his father's that he'd carried for 20 years, because some things you kept not because they were useful, but because they were true. He went to bed. He did not sleep for a long time. Outside, the Texas night settled in around the ranch, the barn, the bunkhouse, the north pasture where the cattle grazed the east fence with its new post set in solid earth. All the things she'd seen needed doing and done without being asked. All the things she'd made better just by being here and being who she was. And somewhere in the dark, in a town 12 miles down the road, Frank Marsh was probably sitting at his own desk doing arithmetic that he thought was going to come out in his favor. And somewhere down the South Road, Arthur Selden was probably composing his next move. And Wade Mercer lay in the dark on the ranch his father had built, and he had fought to keep, and he thought, let them come. He had an answer now that he hadn't had before. He just hadn't said it out loud yet. They left for town before sunrise. Wade drove, and Eliza sat beside him on the wagon bench with a leather satchel on her lap that contained the account information she'd memorized and never written down anywhere that could be found. Jimmy had the ranch. The cattle were in the north pasture. The loan agreement was in the cabinet beside his father's letter. Everything that could be prepared had been prepared. They didn't talk much on the drive. The kind of silence between them now was the kind that didn't need filling, not comfortable exactly because there was too much at stake for comfort, but solid. The silence of two people who had said the things that mattered and were letting them stand. Halfway to town, she said, "Whatever happens at the telegraph office, the transfer may take 2 days to clear. Marsh could move before then." "I know," Wade said. "I'll go see him after I drop you." She looked at him sideways. "What will you say?" "I'll tell him I'm aware of his arrangement with Selden. I'll tell him the note will be paid in full within 48 hours. He kept his eyes on the road. "And I'll tell him that if he calls it before then, I will take what I know about his communication with an outside party to every rancher and merchant in this county." She was quiet for a moment. "That's leverage." "That's the truth," he said. "Leverage is what happens when the truth is inconvenient for somebody." She almost smiled. He heard it in her breath before it reached her face, that small exhale that was the closest she usually came to laughing out loud. He'd come to watch for it. The telegraph office in Harlan's Crossing opened at 7, and the operator, a thin young man named Cal, who had the permanent, slightly startled expression of someone who handled other people's urgent news all day, looked up when they came through the door with the expression of someone who didn't expect company this early. Eliza sat at the counter and wrote her message herself in a clean, rapid hand. She didn't let Wade see it, and he didn't try to see it. That was her account, her money, her business, and the loan agreement they'd signed made it a transaction, not a gift. And that distinction mattered enough to both of them that neither needed to say so. She handed the message to Cal. Cal read it. His eyebrows went up slightly, not at the content probably, but at the name of the receiving institution, which was apparently significant enough to register even to a telegraph operator in West Texas. "This will go through the Dallas relay," Cal said. "Response should come back same day by afternoon at the latest." "I'll wait," Eliza said. Wade looked at her. "I'll go see Marsh. Come find me at the feed store after." She nodded. He put his hat on and walked out. Frank Marsh was already at the bank when Wade got there, because men like Marsh arrived early when they had plans to execute. He was behind his desk with his coat on, and the bank smile in place, and it flickered almost imperceptibly when Wade walked in without knocking and sat down across from him without being invited to. "Wade," Marsh said, recovering smoothly. "I wasn't expecting—" "Arthur Selden came to my ranch yesterday," Wade said. The smile held. "I'm not sure I know who. Frank?" Wade said his name the way he'd said Selden's name to Selden flat final without heat, which was somehow worse than anger. I know about the communication. I know about the private sale clause. I know about the timeline you've been building." He leaned forward slightly. "Now I need you to know something." Marsh was very still. "The note on my property is going to be paid in full, within 48 hours, every dollar with the interest you've compounded onto it." Wade held the man's eyes. "You will not call that note before it's paid. You will not take any action against this property in the next 48 hours. And when it's paid, this bank's business with the Mercer Ranch is finished." "Wade, if you've somehow—" Marsh started carefully. "And if you do anything in those 48 hours that isn't sitting in that chair and waiting," Wade continued, "I will spend the following week having a conversation with every man in this county who has a loan at your bank, about outside arrangements, about private sale clauses, about what it means when a banker's interest in your failure is connected to someone else's interest in your land." He stood up. "Are we clear?" Marsh looked at him. The smile was gone entirely now, and without it, his face was just a face not particularly impressive, not particularly strong, the face of a man who had depended on the smile for a long time and didn't know quite what he was without it. "We're clear," Marsh said quietly. Wade picked up his hat. "Good morning, Frank." He walked out. Pete Alderman was at the feed store, which was lucky because it saved Wade a separate trip. Pete looked up from a discussion about corn prices and took one look at Wade's face and excused himself from the conversation with the instinct of a man who had known Wade Mercer long enough to read the weather. "Selden got to you yet?" Wade asked before Pete could say anything. Pete's expression shifted. "Man came by last night," he said, lowering his voice. "Came to the house. Real smooth. Said he was a friend of a woman you'd married, had some concerns about the situation." "What did you tell him?" "Told him I didn't discuss my neighbor's business with strangers." Pete paused. "He left a card. Said if I had any concerns about things I should reach out." "Burn the card," Wade said. Pete looked at him steadily. "You going to tell me what's actually going on?" "Yes," Wade said, "but not today. Today I need you to know one thing whatever he tells you about Eliza or about me or about the ranch. It comes from a man who had a financial claim on her she didn't agree to and who's been trying to use this county as a way to get it back." He held Pete's gaze. "She's my wife, Pete. What's mine is hers, and what's hers is—" He stopped. Something moved in his chest. "It's complicated, but she's not going back to Philadelphia." Pete looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man who was seeing something in a friend's face that he hadn't seen in a while and wasn't sure he'd ever expected to see again. "All right," Pete said simply. "That's enough for me." The telegraph response came at 1:30. Wade found Eliza in the small waiting area of the telegraph office, sitting straight-backed in the chair with the satchel on her lap, and Cal hovering nearby with the particular nervous energy of someone who has received an answer that felt bigger than his office. She looked up when Wade came through the door. In her hand was a telegraph slip. Her face was calm, but her eyes were doing the thing he'd learned to read the contained version of feeling something significant. "It went through," she said. "The transfer. Confirmed. The funds will be available at the Harlan's First Savings Correspondent account by tomorrow morning." She held up the slip. "I have the confirmation number." He exhaled slowly. "Good." "Did Marsh—" "He'll wait," Wade said. He understood. She nodded. She folded the telegraph slip and put it in the satchel with the precision of someone closing a chapter. Stood up, straightened her dress, and then did something she hadn't done before. She looked at him right in the middle of the telegraph office with Cal pretending not to watch, and she said, "Thank you, Wade." Not for any specific thing. He understood that. It was for the sum of the specific things, for standing in the yard, for going to Marsh, for calling her his wife in front of a man who'd been treating her like inventory for 9 years. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm doing it." The next morning, Eliza walked into Harlan's First Savings at 9 o'clock with the confirmation number and the account details and paid off the entire note on the Mercer ranch. Wade stood beside her because it was his ranch and his debt, and he was going to be present when it was settled, not waiting outside like a man who couldn't face his own business. Marsh processed it without conversation. He was professionally quiet the entire time, not sullen, just absent in a way that meant he was recalibrating, figuring out what story he would tell himself and others about how this had gone. He handed Wade the paid-in-full document with both hands, and the expression of a man returning something he'd borrowed longer than he should have. Wade folded it and put it in his coat pocket. They walked out of the bank into the June morning, and Wade stood on the street for a moment, just holding that feeling, the weight that had been on his chest for 2 years, lighter now by the exact amount of the paid note, which turned out to be more than the dollar figure. "How do you feel?" Eliza asked beside him. "Like I can breathe in full again," he said. She nodded, as if she understood that exactly, as if she had some experience with the particular sensation of a weightlifting that you'd carried so long, you'd stopped noticing how much it bent you. Then a voice said, "How touching." They both turned. Selden was standing 20 feet away on the street. He hadn't come from anywhere obvious. He'd simply materialized the way men like him did, in the right place at the right moment, because they paid people to know where right places were. He was alone this time. No hired hand, no buggy. Just Selden in his city coat and his silver temples, looking at both of them with the expression of a man making a final assessment. Wade felt Eliza go still beside him, not with fear, with the stillness of someone deciding. "I know about the transfer," Selden said, directly dropping all pretense of warmth. "Calloway and Briggs have already filed an emergency petition in the Philadelphia Court of Equity. They're challenging your access to the personal account on the grounds that your father's will contains a provision limiting." "The personal account was established by my mother," Eliza said. "Her money, her estate, transferred to me at her death when I was 7 years old. It has never been part of the Hartwell trading assets, and it is not subject to my father's will in any court in any state." She looked at him with complete steadiness. "Calloway and Briggs know this. They filed the petition anyway because you told them to and because they thought I might not know it well enough to fight it." A pause. "I know it exactly well enough." Selden looked at her for a long moment. And in that moment, something shifted in his face. Not defeat, not yet, but the first real crack in the certainty. The first place where the chess player looked at the board and saw that the position he'd been building for years was not what he'd thought it was. "There are other avenues," he said. "Yes," she said. "There always are for men like you. There will always be another petition, another clause, another legal instrument you haven't tried yet." She took one step toward him, just one, measured and deliberate. "But I will be 25 years old in November, Arthur. In November, I take control of the Hartwell estate with full legal authority, and every avenue you've spent 9 years building closes at once." Another step. "You have 4 months. You can spend them filing petitions that my lawyers will answer, or you can spend them making peace with the fact that my father's company is going to be run by his daughter and not by you. Those are your choices." The street was quiet around them. Harlan's Crossing went about its business, a wagon, moving a door opening somewhere, the ordinary sounds of a Tuesday morning in a small Texas town. And in the middle of it, Arthur Selden looked at Eliza Hartwell and saw, perhaps for the first time, the actual woman rather than the asset. He looked at Wade. Wade said nothing. He didn't need to. He'd said what he had to say the day before in the yard, and it was still true, and Selden's face told him the man had not forgotten it. Selden straightened his coat, put his hat on. "I'll be in contact through the firm," he said to Eliza formally, the way men retreat into procedure when they've run out of other options. "I'll have my lawyer answer," she said. He walked away. This time, he didn't look back. Wade watched him go until he turned a corner and was out of sight. Then he looked at Eliza. Her chin was level, her hands at her sides, and she was watching the empty corner where Selden had been with the expression of someone watching something that had been following them for a very long time. Finally stop. "You have a lawyer?" Wade asked. "I'll have one by Friday," she said. Pete Alderman mentioned his cousin practices in Austin. He stared at her. "When did you talk to Pete about his cousin?" "This morning while you were settling the horse." She glanced at him. "I asked. He told me. It took 4 minutes." He looked at her for a long moment. "4 months," he said. "4 months," she agreed. "And then it's over. Then the estate is mine. Selden loses his claim entirely. Calloway and Briggs lose their management fees." She paused. "And yes, then it's over." He picked up his hat, which he'd taken off at some point during the confrontation and hadn't noticed. Put it back on. "Then we've got 4 months of work ahead of us," he said. "Legal work, ranch work, cattle work. You still think moving the herd to the north section was right?" She blinked. The shift from Selden and inherited fortunes to cattle rotation was fast enough that it caught her slightly off guard, and in that fraction of a second, he saw her face do something it almost never did. It went soft, not weak, just soft the way a person's face goes when they are given something they needed so badly they'd stopped expecting it. "Yes," she said, recovering. "The east section needs another 6 weeks of rest before the grass is ready." "Then that's what we'll do," he said. "Come on. Jimmy will have had enough of those cattle by noon." They drove home. Halfway there, Eliza said, "We should get properly married." Wade kept his eyes on the road. "I know. The legal standing will matter with the estate proceedings. A properly recorded marriage?" "I know," he said again. "I was thinking the same thing." She was quiet for a moment. "You were?" "Practical reasons," he said. "Of course," she said. Another silence. Longer this time, the kind that had things moving through it. "Also," he said without looking at her, "because I'd like to, if you would." He heard her breathe, just once carefully. "Yes," she said. "I would." He nodded. They drove the rest of the way in a silence that was the best kind, the kind that had already said everything important, and was just letting it sit in the air between two people who had learned slowly and sideways, and without ever planning to, that the other person was someone worth saying it to. They were married on a Saturday in July, in the front room of the ranch house, with a circuit preacher who came through Harlan's Crossing twice a year, and Pete Alderman as witness, and Jimmy Creed standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, looking like he might cry and being very determined not to. The ceremony was short. Neither of them had wanted elaborate. The preacher read the words, and they said the words back, and it was done. And afterward, Pete shook Wade's hand for a long time and hugged Eliza with the uncomplicated warmth of a man who had decided she was good people and had no more complex opinion about it than that. Jimmy shook Eliza's hand, and then, after a moment's visible internal debate, hugged her quickly and awkwardly, and stepped back and looked at the ceiling. "Congratulations," he said to the ceiling. "Thank you, Jimmy," she said. The letter from Calloway and Briggs arrived in August. It was, as Eliza had predicted, a petition filed in the Pennsylvania Court of Equity citing multiple provisions of the Hartwell estate documents and challenging Eliza's competency to manage the assets independently. It was thorough, expensive, and the clear product of lawyers who had spent months preparing it. The Austin lawyer Eliza had retained a compact, no-nonsense woman named Margaret Hale, who Pete's cousin had recommended without hesitation, received it, read it, and wrote back a response that was exactly twice as long and considerably more specific. Margaret Hale, had it emerged, spent 15 years in estate law before relocating to Texas, and she found the Hartwell case, as she told Eliza in a letter, "the most straightforwardly winnable thing I've seen in a decade, if we simply let the calendar do its work." They let the calendar do its work. Selden filed 2 more petitions. Margaret answered both. The Philadelphia court declined to rule on either before November, which was, Margaret wrote with professional satisfaction, exactly what she had anticipated. Wade watched all of this from the practical distance of a man running a ranch present, attentive but not in the middle of it because it was Eliza's battle and she knew how to fight it, and his job was to make sure the ground she was standing on held firm. He moved the cattle to the north section. The east pasture recovered. The calving percentage in the fall was 63%, the best it had been in 4 years. He hired a second hand to cover the work Jimmy couldn't do alone, a quiet veteran named Amos, who had steady hands and no unnecessary opinions. The ranch breathed. Not easily, not without work, but with the steady rhythm of a place that had found its footing again. November came on a cold, clear morning with frost on the fence posts and the cattle breathing steam in the north pasture. Eliza's 25th birthday was on the 14th. On the 15th, Margaret Hale telegraphed from Austin with a message that was 3 words long. It is done. The Hartwell estate passed to Eliza Mercer, her name now legally on both sides of the ledger, with full control, full authority, and no further claim by Arthur Selden, or the firm of Calloway and Briggs, who had sent a final formal letter acknowledging the transfer with the stiff, airless language of men who had lost and were determined to look dignified about it. Selden himself sent nothing. No letter, no telegram. Just silence. The silence of a man who had been outweighted by a woman he'd spent 9 years trying to own, and who had nothing left to say about it. That evening, Wade came in from the barn and found Eliza at the kitchen table with the telegram in front of her, and both hands flat on either side of it, the way she'd held the first letter from the law firm all those months ago. But different. That time her hands had been pressed down to hold something in. This time, they were just resting. Open, still. He sat down across from her, down. She looked up. Her eyes were bright, not tears exactly, but the close neighbor of tears, the way eyes get when something that has been held tightly for a very long time is finally allowed to release. "It's over," she said. "I know," he said. "Margaret wired me too." She looked at him. "She wired you." "I asked her to," he said. "Didn't want to hear it secondhand." Something moved through her face, warmth, and something older than warmth, something that had been built slowly over 6 months of fence posts and loan agreements, and standing together in the yard. "What happens now?" she asked. The same question she'd asked in the yard on the night Selden left months ago. But different now. Not frightened, not bracing. Just asking. Just wanting to know what came next with the open, uncomplicated directness of a woman who had stopped running and meant to stay stopped. Wade looked at his hands on the table. Those scarred, worn hands. Then he looked at her. "I asked you once for your truth," he said. "You gave it to me. All of it piece by piece, whether you planned to or not." He paused. "I think what happens now is we keep doing that. Every day. Whatever comes at the ranch, whatever comes from Philadelphia, whatever the cattle do, whatever the weather does, we handle it the way we've been handling it." He met her eyes. "Together. On ground that belongs to both of us." She was quiet for a moment, just looking at him. "I want to put money into the ranch," she said, "from the estate. Not as charity and not as a loan, as a partner. I want the deed to reflect both our names." He'd thought about this. He'd known it was coming. He'd spent 3 months deciding how he felt about it, and had arrived in the end at the only honest answer. "All right," he said. She blinked. "That's it. All right. You're my wife," he said simply. "What's mine is yours. I said that to Pete in the feed store, and I meant it. It goes both ways, or it doesn't go." He held her gaze. "You want to build something here with your name on it? Then let's build it. The right way. Together." She looked at him for a long moment, with those gray-green eyes that had looked straight through him on the day she stepped off the stagecoach, and he thought about how wrong he'd been about what he was looking at. He'd thought she was looking through him, assessing him, measuring his worth, calculating her options. And she had been doing all of those things. But she'd also been doing something else that he hadn't understood until much later. She'd been looking for somewhere to land, looking to see if the ground was solid, if the person was real, if it was safe to stop. She'd decided it was. And everything that came after had been her making it true. "Then stay," she said. The word landed like a fence post set in good earth, the same word she'd said once before months ago in a different moment, and it meant the same thing now that it had meant then and more. He looked at her. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Outside, the Texas night settled over the Mercer Ranch, over the north pasture, and the east section resting, and the new post solid in the ground, and the barn with its reorganized feed, and the bunkhouse where Jimmy and Amos were probably playing cards, and the kitchen garden with its straight bean rows, and the wide, dark, indifferent sky that had watched all of it and offered no opinion. A man who had once ordered a wife like a plow because he believed love was a luxury a practical man couldn't afford. A woman who had run from a life that wanted to make her into something owned and found in the last place anyone would have thought to look for her, what it felt like to be seen. They had built this together. Not from shared history or romantic beginning, or any of the soft origins love was supposed to have. They'd built it from work and honesty, and the slow accumulation of days where two people with no reason to trust each other had chosen it again and again quietly without ceremony, until the choice was just the shape of their lives. The ranch was no longer just survival. It was a home built from truth and trust, and the choice two people made every single day to stay.